A cut goes bad. Not the dramatic kind, not a sword through the chest or a lion's claw across the throat. A thorn, a splinter of bone while you're butchering meat, a nick from a flint edge no wider than your thumbnail. In the ancient world, that was enough. That was often the whole story. Infection before antibiotics wasn't exotic. It was waiting inside every scratch, every pulled tooth, every birth. And here is what you need to know before any of this makes sense. Not everyone died. Some did, quickly and terribly. Some survived without understanding why. And the distance between those two outcomes was almost never the remedy, almost never the healer. It was something older and colder than either. So picture your own hand. A puncture, something small, a few days old. It's warm to the touch now. Tight. The skin around it pulling in a way it didn't yesterday. That is where this story begins. Start with the baseline truth. Most of recorded history is a record of people dying from things that would bore a modern emergency room. Infected cuts, childbirth fever, a molar that rotted into the jaw, a battlefield wound that closed too soon over dirty cloth and became a slow catastrophe under the skin. Ignaz Semmelweis documented in the 1840s in Vienna that 1 in 10 women admitted to hospital maternity wards died of puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection carried hand to hand by the physicians themselves. Before Semmelweis, before germ theory, before anyone knew what was being carried, the dying was ordinary, routine, a fact of the room, but not universal. Not every woman died. Not every wound festered. And that gap, the one between the woman who died on day 3 and the woman who walked out holding her child, that gap is what actually explains ancient survival. Not the remedies. The filter came first. Your immune system ran the first triage. It did then exactly what it does now. Mounting a local response, flooding the site with white blood cells, trying to wall off the contamination before it could reach the blood. Whether that worked depended on things no healer could touch, the size of the initial bacterial load, meaning how much got in, the location of the wound, a deep puncture of the hand being far more dangerous than a long, shallow cut on the forearm, because depth traps the bacteria and limits drainage. Age, nutrition, whether the person had survived a previous exposure to a similar organism and carried some residual resistance. And luck. Plain and unreasonable, because the same wound in 2 people with identical circumstances could resolve in one and kill the other, and ancient medicine had no framework to explain why. It just watched, but it watched carefully. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an Egyptian surgical text copied around 1600 BCE and likely based on material centuries older, describes wounds with a precision that stops you. A gaping wound in the head, a split to the skull. The scribe doesn't guess at invisible causes. He notes what he sees. The swelling, the heat, the smell, the color of discharge, whether the wound drains or seals. He categorizes injuries by prognosis. Treatable, contestable, not to be treated at all. That last category is clinical detachment in an ancient voice. The Egyptians understood, without germ theory, that some wound states meant the person was already lost. Hippocrates, working in Greece, in the 5th century BCE, observed that wounds which smelled sweet and drained clear fared better than wounds which smelled foul and retained fluid. He was right, not because he understood bacteria, but because he was watching drainage and he noticed what good drainage looked like against what bad drainage looked like. The observation was sound even though the theory behind it was entirely wrong. Battlefield injury records sharpen this further. Roman military surgeons, working from at least the 1st century CE, knew to remove foreign material from wounds immediately. Arrowheads, fabric, splinters of bone. Not because they understood infection, but because they had watched enough soldiers to know that wounds containing foreign matter killed faster. The logic was incomplete. The practice was accidentally correct. Because what they were doing, without knowing it, was reducing the bacterial load at the site and improving the conditions for drainage. Wash the wound. Keep it open. Do not pack it closed before it has drained. 3 rules arrived at through pattern recognition across centuries of watching. People die when the rules were broken, but some wounds didn't drain. Some sealed and swelled and pressed inward and became abscesses. And here is where the ancient world got strange and harder to watch. A dental abscess in 400 BCE didn't mean a dentist and a course of amoxicillin. It meant pain for days or weeks until the abscess either ruptured on its own, which sometimes brought relief and sometimes spread the infection into the jaw and the throat, or until a healer lanced it with a heated iron or a sharpened instrument, which sometimes drained it and sometimes introduced new contamination into the site. Trepanation, the drilling of holes into the skull, was practiced across cultures from Peru to Europe and shows evidence of healing bone in some cases, meaning patients survived the procedure, but it was used for conditions that included headache, seizure, and presumably pressure from intracranial infection, and the outcomes were as variable as you would expect from a hole drilled by hand into living skull. Cautery, burning tissue closed with heated metal, appeared in Greek, Roman, and Egyptian medicine as a response to wounds that would not stop bleeding or to infected soft tissue, and it worked in the brutal sense that it destroyed the contaminated area. It also destroyed everything around it. The cure was a different kind of damage. What looks primitive, though, often had a rough logic underneath it. Incomplete, misattributed, sometimes lethal in its application, but not random. And that is exactly where this is going next. So when the healer reached for something other than a blade and a fire, what exactly did they reach for? And the honest answer is that some of it worked. Not completely. Not reliably. Not in the way a course of penicillin works, killing the organism at the source and clearing the infection in days. But enough. Enough that the pattern repeated, enough that healers kept using it across centuries and continents. Enough that when modern researchers eventually looked at the mechanism, they found something real underneath the ritual. Honey appears in wound dressings across Egyptian, Greek, and Ayurvedic traditions. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical compilation dating to roughly 1550 BCE, references honey in topical preparations for wounds and skin conditions. For a long time, this looked like superstition in a jar. Then the mechanism came clear. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it pulls moisture out of its environment, and bacteria need water to replicate. It is also mildly acidic and produces hydrogen peroxide at low concentrations as a byproduct of its own chemistry. Some varieties, Manuka in particular, carry additional antimicrobial compounds. Honey on a wound did not cure infection the way antibiotics do, but it slowed bacterial growth at the surface, kept the wound moist enough to heal without sealing over dead tissue, and created a hostile environment for the organisms trying to colonize the outer layers. It worked just enough. Not enough to save the soldier with a deep infected thigh wound. Enough to help a shallow cut on the forearm stay clean, while the immune system did the actual work underneath. Moldy substances are stranger and harder to trace cleanly. There are accounts across multiple traditions, including Serbian folk medicine and certain medieval European texts, of applying moldy bread or moldy soil to infected wounds. The obvious modern reflex is to see this as a direct precursor to penicillin, to draw a clean line from superstition to Fleming. That line is not clean. Most molds do not produce penicillin. Many are harmful. The practice was inconsistent and the outcomes would have been unpredictable, but some penicillium species do grow on bread. The possibility that occasional applications of moldy material coincidentally delivered low concentrations of antifungal or antibacterial compounds to a wound is real. It likely happened by accident more than design. The healers who kept using it weren't wrong to keep using it. They were pattern readers without a microscope, and the pattern said it sometimes helped. Copper was used for wound washing in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian medicine. Wine and vinegar appeared in Greek and Roman wound care, and Galen, the 2nd century Roman physician whose influence on Western medicine persisted for over 1,000 years, recommended wine irrigation of wounds. Alcohol and acetic acid in vinegar are genuinely antimicrobial at sufficient concentration. They kill or inhibit surface bacteria. Wine is dilute enough that it does not destroy tissue the way pure alcohol would. Galen did not know why this helped. He had a theory built around humors and balance that was entirely wrong. But he had watched enough wounds washed with wine against wounds not washed with wine to know that the wine ones did better. The correct practice survived inside an incorrect theory for 15 centuries. Willow bark is different because the mechanism runs to pain rather than infection. The bark contains salicin, which the body metabolizes into salicylic acid, a precursor to aspirin. It reduces fever and dulls pain. For a person with an infected wound, reducing fever buys time and capacity to function. Dulling pain prevents the kind of shock and exhaustion that accelerated death in the ancient world. Willow bark did not fight the infection, but it kept the person more functional while the infection was being fought, and that margin was sometimes the difference. Maggots are the part of this that is hardest to say plainly. Certain fly larvae, specifically Lucilia sericata, eat only dead and necrotic tissue. They do not consume living cells. Military surgeons observed across multiple conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War, that soldiers whose wounds had been colonized by maggots, before treatment, sometimes showed less gangrene than comparable wounds kept clean. The maggots had debrided the wound, removing the dead tissue that bacteria feed on, more precisely than any instrument a field surgeon carried. Battlefield records from the Civil War period document this, though the understanding of why was incomplete until later. This is where the grimmest arithmetic of ancient medicine lives. On a surgical table in 1863, with gangrene climbing a man's leg, the choice was amputation with a saw through living bone, or the slow spread of the infection into the blood. Most surgeons chose the saw. Some wounds were already packed with maggots before the surgeon arrived, and those wounds occasionally stopped the surgeon from needing to. The maggots had already done the debridement. The body was fighting on cleaner ground. Here is what this overturns. The simple modern reading is that ancient healers were ignorant, and that ancient medicine was a theater of cruelty and superstition, occasionally interrupted by luck. That reading is wrong. The healers who kept using honey after watching it work on 100 wounds were doing what the hunter in the earlier part of this story did with the gazelle, gathering signs, building a pattern, predicting outcomes from repeated observation. Without germ theory, without microscopes, without clinical trials, they arrived at interventions that had real mechanisms, incomplete, inconsistently applied, sometimes lethal in the wrong dose or the wrong context, but not random. What they were doing, almost all of it, was reducing damage rather than curing disease, cleaning the surface, slowing bacterial growth at the margin, removing dead tissue, controlling pain long enough for the actual fighter to work. The actual fighter was always the same. It was the thing that makes your skin warm around a splinter right now, the thing that sealed that puncture in your hand, section by section, white cell by white cell, building scar tissue from the inside out. The inflammation you find annoying is the same ancient response that kept the species alive across every century that predates Alexander Fleming's Petri dish. Your body still does all of this. It inflames to isolate. It fevers to create an environment hostile to bacteria. It drains to remove what it cannot kill in place. It scars because sealing the breach permanently costs less than leaving it open. The remedies work just enough to keep the person alive, long enough for all of that to finish. Antibiotics change what is possible. But your body was already the first doctor, and it has been practicing far longer than anyone who ever called themselves one.